When I was 15, my stepfather took me out on his boat for what he called a father-daughter bonding weekend, and then he motored away and left me on a sandbar in the middle of Lake Superior. I'm Marin, and the morning my life cracked in half started with him handing me a thermos of cocoa like nothing was wrong. He packed sandwiches in the cooler. He'd asked if I brought sunscreen. He'd even let me pick the radio station on the drive up from Duluth. So, when he killed the engine about a mile out from the marina and pointed at this little hump of sand barely big enough to fit a picnic blanket, I thought he was joking. "Hop out," he said. "Take a look around. I'll be right back." He had this little half smile, the kind he used when he was being patient with me in front of my mom. I rolled up my jeans and slid off the back of the boat into water that came up to my thighs, cold enough to burn. I waded the 10 feet to the sandbar, turned around to make some comment about how dumb this was, and watched him pull the throttle. The boat lurched, swung north, and just kept going. I stood there with wet jeans and the thermos still in my hand, waiting for him to circle back. Lake Superior in mid-September is not a friendly body of water. The wind picks up by afternoon and the temperature drops the second the sun starts sliding west. I waited maybe 20 minutes before I really understood that he wasn't coming back. Stay with me until the end and I'll tell you how that sandbar was only the start of what he did to me and how 9 years later he walked into the dental office where I work and tried to pretend he was just another patient. My phone was in my back pocket. I pulled it out with shaking hands and saw 2 bars, then 1, then nothing. I tried calling my mom anyway. It rang once and dropped. I tried 911. Same thing. I tried my best friend Priya. Nothing. The sandbar was maybe 12 feet across at the widest. There was no shade, no rocks, no debris, nothing but wet sand and a few washed-up sticks. The shoreline was a green smudge to the south, way too far to swim, especially in jeans and a hoodie. I sat down because my knees were doing this thing where they wouldn't quite hold me, and I tried to think. He had to come back. He had a wife waiting for him. He had a kid of his own from his first marriage. He had a contracting business with employees who were expecting him Monday. There was no version of this where he just kept driving the boat and pretended I never existed. Right? The thermos had maybe 2 cups of cocoa in it. I rationed it without really thinking about it, taking the tiniest sips because some part of my brain had already given up on him coming back, even though the rest of me was still telling myself I was being dramatic. The sun started going down around 7. The wind picked up. My jeans were still damp from wading, and they wouldn't dry, and pretty soon I was shivering so hard my teeth were knocking together. I curled up in the middle of the sandbar with my hood pulled tight and tried to keep my body heat in. I remember thinking very clearly, this is how people die. Not in some big dramatic way. Just slowly, on a piece of sand the size of a kitchen, while everyone they love is 40 miles away eating dinner. That first night was the longest stretch of time I have ever lived through. I didn't sleep exactly. I would slip under for a minute or two and then jerk awake convinced I'd heard a motor. There were no motors, just the lake slapping against the sand and the wind, and the occasional cry of some bird I couldn't see. Around 3 in the morning I started crying, and then I made myself stop because the salt on my face was making me colder. I kept replaying the boat ride out. He'd been so normal. He'd asked about school. He'd asked if I was still mad about the thing with my phone bill. He'd told me I was getting too old to keep treating him like a stranger. And I'd said something snotty back, something like, "Well, you treat me like one too." And he'd just laughed and turned up the radio. I kept turning that conversation over in my head, trying to figure out if I'd done something to deserve this. And that's the part that still makes me angry when I think about it now. That a 15-year-old kid would be sitting on a freezing sandbar in the middle of the night trying to figure out what she did wrong. The sun came up gray and slow. My phone was at 4% and still had no signal. I drank the last of the cocoa, which was cold and gross by then, and I made myself stand up and walk in tight little circles to get blood back into my legs. I knew about hypothermia from a unit we'd done in health class. I knew about dehydration. I knew that the lake water was technically drinkable in an emergency because Superior is fresh. even though the thought of cupping my hands into that cold made me want to scream. I did it anyway, because my mouth was so dry my tongue felt like it was sticking to itself. Around mid-morning, I started waving my hoodie over my head whenever I thought I saw a boat in the distance. I saw 3. None of them saw me. They were too far out, headed for the bigger islands further north. By afternoon, I was so tired I could barely lift my arms. I want to tell you that what saved me was something brave I did. It wasn't. What saved me was a retired fishing guide named Walt, who'd come out alone in his little aluminum boat to do some end-of-season trolling, and decided on a whim to take the long way back to the marina. He told me later he almost didn't see me because I was sitting down by then and the sandbar barely poked out of the chop. What he saw was movement, a flash of red from my hoodie, and he came in close to check. I was almost too cold to talk. He wrapped me in a wool blanket from his bench seat and gave me a bottle of water and asked, very gently, what in the hell I was doing out there. I tried to answer and just started crying. He didn't push. He radioed the Coast Guard from his boat, and he sat with me on that bench all the way back to shore, his hand on my shoulder like he was afraid I'd jump. The first thing I told the Coast Guard officer was that my stepfather had left me there. The officer's face did this thing. This tiny flicker of professional shock that he tried to hide. He asked me to repeat it. I repeated it. They had me on the radio with a paramedic within 10 minutes. By the time we got to the dock, there were 2 squad cars and an ambulance waiting. They wrapped me in those crinkly silver blankets and asked for my mom's phone number, and I gave them my aunt's instead, my mom's older sister, Aunt Rosalind, who lived in 2 harbors. I couldn't explain why I didn't want them to call my mom. I just knew, in some animal part of myself, that I needed to talk to someone else first. Aunt Roz drove down in her old Subaru with the dog still in the back seat because she hadn't even stopped to drop it off. She held my face in both her hands in the hospital hallway and said my name over and over and over. They kept me overnight for observation. Mild hypothermia, dehydration, a bunch of scratches I didn't remember getting. While I was in that bed under the heated blanket they wouldn't let me take off, a deputy came in with a notepad and asked me to tell him exactly what happened. I did. He wrote it down. He asked me where my mother was. I said I didn't know if she knew yet. He said someone would talk to her. Here's what I found out over the next few days, mostly from Aunt Roz, who couldn't keep a secret if her life depended on it. My stepfather, whose name was Glenn, had docked the boat at the marina around 4 in the afternoon. The same day he left me. He'd loaded up his truck. He'd driven home. He'd told my mother I had gotten into a fight with him about going home early and that I'd called a friend to come pick me up at the marina and that I'd told him I was going to spend the night at Priya's house. My mom had bought it. She didn't even call Priya. He'd specifically picked the friend whose mom my mom didn't really know, so a check-in call would feel weird. He'd had dinner. He'd watched Sunday night football. He'd gone to bed in my mother's house while I was out on that sandbar shivering myself half to death. When the police showed up at their door Monday morning, my mom thought there'd been an accident. She thought I'd been hit by a car at the marina or something. When they told her what had actually happened, she sat down on the kitchen floor and didn't get up for a long time. I didn't go back to that house. Aunt Roz took me in. I lived with her and her husband, Uncle Pete, in a small lake house on the North Shore for the rest of high school. Glenn was arrested. He was charged with child endangerment and criminal neglect. He got out on bail the same day, which I will never understand as long as I live. He took a plea deal eventually, a year of supervised probation and some mandatory parenting class, which felt like a joke since I wasn't his kid. He never spent a single night in jail for what he did to me. My mother chose him. I don't know how else to put it. She came to see me at Aunt Roz's house exactly twice. Both times she cried more than I did. Both times she told me Glenn was getting help, that he hadn't meant for it to go so far, that he thought I'd just sit on the sandbar for a couple hours and learn a lesson about respecting him. A lesson about respecting him. The second time she said that I asked her to leave, and I didn't see her again for almost 3 years. Aunt Roz handled the paperwork to become my legal guardian. My mom signed it. I think she was relieved. Glenn didn't want me around and she didn't want to choose, so she found a way to not have to. I graduated high school from a different school district than I'd grown up in. I went to a community college in Duluth, lived in a tiny basement apartment that smelled like the radiator, worked nights at a diner to pay tuition. I got into a dental hygiene program because Aunt Roz said there were always going to be teeth, and she wasn't wrong. By the time I was 23, I had my certification and a job at a family practice in St. Paul, which is where I went to put some real distance between me and that sandbar. I rented a one-bedroom in a converted Victorian, adopted a one-eyed cat from the shelter, and started building a life that didn't have my mother's voice in it. I went to therapy. Lots of therapy. I joined a peer support group through a place that worked with adult survivors of family abuse. I learned how to say the word abuse without flinching, which took longer than you'd think. I learned that what my mother did by choosing him and then choosing him again and then choosing him again was its own kind of abandonment, separate from the sandbar. I learned that my body still didn't like being on boats, and that was okay, and I didn't have to push myself to get over it just because other people thought I should. I dated a little. I made friends. I started running in the mornings, which I had never done as a kid because Glenn used to say running was for people who couldn't afford gym memberships. Every mile felt like a tiny middle finger to him. I hadn't seen Glenn in 9 years when he walked into the dental office. It was a Thursday in October. I was in the back checking the autoclave when my coworker poked her head in and said, "Marin, your 11 o'clock is here." I came out, picked up the chart, and called the name from the waiting room. "Mr. Holloway?" That's not my stepfather's last name. Glenn's last name is Vance. So when he stood up from the chair by the window and walked toward me with this nervous little smile, my brain didn't catch up for about 3 full seconds. I just stood there, holding a clipboard, watching this man cross a beige carpet toward me. He'd gotten older. His hair had gone almost completely gray. He was thinner than I remembered, and there was a softness around his middle that hadn't been there. But it was him, the same eyes a-holding his shoulders like he was always slightly bracing for something. "Hi, Marin," he said, quiet, like he didn't want the receptionist to hear. "I knew you worked here. I'm sorry, I had to find a way." My hand started shaking so hard I almost dropped the clipboard. I remember thinking, very clearly, do not faint in front of him. I turned around without saying a word and walked into the back office. My coworker followed me. She'd seen my face. I asked her to please cancel the appointment, that the patient was someone I wasn't allowed to see, and could she please get the office manager. The office manager was a woman named Denise who had been doing this for 30 years, and who, bless her, didn't ask a single question. She walked out, told Glenn the appointment was being rescheduled, walked him to the door, and locked it behind him. Then she came back and asked me if I wanted to call the police. I said not yet. I needed to sit down. I sat in the back room for an hour. Denise brought me a paper cup of water and didn't say anything. When my hand stopped shaking, I called Aunt Roz. She told me to come up that weekend, to sleep on her couch and drink her terrible coffee and let her dog put its head on my knee. She also told me, very calmly, that I needed to consider getting a restraining order. I said I'd think about it. That night, I sat on my kitchen floor with the cat on my lap and stared at the wall for a long time. The thing I kept coming back to was not fear exactly. It was rage. He had known where I worked. He had taken the time to find me. He had used a fake last name to get past the receptionist. He had walked into my place of work like he had any right to be there. Like 9 years of silence was just a pause and he could pick up wherever he wanted. And he hadn't even bothered to look ashamed. He'd looked nervous. He'd looked apologetic. He'd looked like a man who was sure that if he just got the chance to talk to me, he could make it okay. The email started a week later. He'd found my work email somehow, probably the same way he'd found the office. The first one was long, no subject line. He told me his wife had died. He told me he was getting sober. He told me he was in some kind of men's accountability group at his church. He said he thought about that day on the lake constantly. He said he hadn't meant for it to go past a couple of hours, that he'd been planning to come back at sunset and act like he'd had engine trouble, But then a friend had called him from the marina about a job, and he'd panicked and gone home, and then he'd been too scared to admit what he'd done. And the longer he waited, the worse it got. He said he knew it didn't excuse anything. He said he just wanted me to know he hadn't meant for me to be out there overnight. As if 8 hours on a sandbar would have been fine. I didn't reply. I forwarded the email to my therapist. I forwarded it to the office manager. I forwarded it to Aunt Roz, who forwarded it to her lawyer. 3 more emails came that week. Then he started showing up. Not at the office, he was smart enough not to do that twice, but at the coffee shop near my apartment. The first time was a Tuesday morning. I came in for my usual, and he was sitting at the corner table, and when he saw me he stood up so fast he knocked his chair over. I turned around and walked back out, and called the police from the sidewalk. The officer who came took the report seriously. He'd been a kid in Duluth once. He'd heard about my case, vaguely. The way people hear about local stories that make the news for a week and then disappear. He told me Minnesota's harassment laws were pretty strong and that a no-contact order was very much on the table. I filed for one. Aunt Roz drove down to come with me to the hearing. The judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She read the file. She asked Glenn a single question, which was whether he had been at the coffee shop on the morning in question. Glenn started to explain that it had been a coincidence, that he was just trying to get the chance to apologize, that I was being unreasonable. The judge cut him off. She granted the order in about 90 seconds. 500 feet at all times, no contact through any medium. 2 years, renewable. Glenn looked like he'd been slacked. He kept looking at me like I was supposed to feel sorry for him, like the judge was being unfair, like I was going to walk over and tell her she'd misunderstood. I looked at the wall behind his head until it was over. In the parking lot afterward, Aunt Roz hugged me for a long time and then said, "Honey, your mother called me last week." I hadn't talked to my mother in almost 5 years at that point. I waited. Aunt Roz told me that my mom had finally left Glenn, that she'd left him about 8 months ago, that she'd been calling Aunt Roz periodically, trying to find a way back to me. I asked Aunt Roz why she hadn't told me. She said because she wasn't going to put one more thing on me until I was ready, and I wasn't ready. I started crying in the parking lot. I'm not sure I could have told you what I was crying about. I didn't call my mother. Not that week, not the next. I had too much to deal with. The restraining order didn't stop the emails completely, because Glenn kept making new accounts, and every time he sent one, I had to forward it to the police and add it to the file. He called my office twice. He sent a card to my apartment which freaked me out so badly I broke my lease and moved to a place across the river the next month. He found my Instagram even though I'd locked it down and tried to follow me from 3 different accounts. Every time he did something, I documented it. Every time. My therapist said I was building a paper trail. I called it building a wall. About 6 weeks after the hearing, I made a video. I'd been watching a lot of TikTok by then. I'd seen women my age and a little older talking about what they'd lived through, and I'd watched the comments fill up with other people saying, "Me too, me too, me too." I had never thought of myself as someone who would do that. But that night, after I'd spent an hour on the phone with a detective documenting Glenn's latest email, I propped my phone up against a stack of dental textbooks and hit record. I didn't show my face the first time. I just filmed my hands and I told the story in pieces. 15 years old. Lake Superior, Sandbar. Coco. Wool blanket. Walt. I named what Glenn did. I named what my mother had done by staying. I didn't use any real names except mine. I posted it before I could overthink it. I went to bed thinking maybe 100 people would see it. When I woke up, it had 80,000 views. By the end of that week, it had 3 million. The comments were a tidal wave, people who had survived similar things, people who had not survived them, writing on behalf of siblings or friends, people with questions, with rage, with kindness. A woman messaged me to say she'd been left at a truck stop in Wyoming by her father at age 12, and that she had never told anyone, and that she was telling her therapist this week because of me. A man in his 50s wrote that he had done something like what Glenn did to me to his own daughter when she was a teenager, that he had been sober for 9 years now, that he had spent every one of those years trying to make it right, and that he wanted me to know that some of us do eventually figure out that we were monsters. That one I read 3 times. I didn't reply to it. I'm still not sure what I think about it. What I didn't expect was that Glenn would see the video, or that his side of the family would, or that the small contracting business he'd been trying to rebuild after my mother left him would lose 3 clients in the next 2 weeks because someone in his town had recognized him from my description even though I hadn't used his name. He emailed me again from yet another account. He didn't ask me to take the video down. He told me I was destroying his life. He told me his current employees had families and that I was hurting them too. He told me I was no better than he was. I forwarded that one to the police along with all the others. I made a second video, talking about the pattern of abusers who try to make you feel guilty for the consequences of their own behavior. I didn't show my face on that one either. It got 2 million views in 3 days. The thing nobody warns you about peaceful revenge, if that's even what this was, is that it doesn't actually feel like winning. It felt more like setting down something I had been carrying for so long I'd forgotten what it weighed. I didn't get joy out of Glenn's clients leaving him. I didn't pop champagne when I heard from Aunt Roz that he'd been asked to leave his church's men's group because too many of the members had seen the video and didn't want him there anymore. I just felt this strange, quiet relief that the truth was finally bigger than he was. He had spent 9 years telling whoever asked that the whole thing had been a stupid misunderstanding, that I was a difficult kid who'd run off, that the courts had overreacted. Now the actual story was out there in my own voice and nobody was going to confuse the two anymore. My mother saw the video. Of course she did. She called Aunt Roz, sobbing, asking if it was really me. Aunt Roz told her yes and then hung up. A week later, a letter came in the mail at Aunt Roz's address, handwritten. Aunt Roz scanned it and emailed it to me and asked if I wanted to read it. I sat on it for a few days. Then I opened it. My mom didn't make excuses. That was the first thing I noticed. She didn't say Glenn had manipulated her, even though I think he had. She didn't say she'd been afraid of him, even though I think she had been. She wrote that she had chosen him over me, that she knew it, that she had known it the morning the police came to her door and she had known it every single day since, and that she was sorry. She wrote that she was in therapy now. She wrote that she didn't expect to be forgiven and that she wasn't writing to ask for that. She wrote that she had watched my video and that hearing my voice described that night had broken something in her that she didn't know was still whole. She wrote that she would not contact me again unless I asked her to, and that she just wanted me to know she had finally understood. I read that letter 4 times. I cried. I put it in a drawer and didn't think about it for 2 weeks. Then I took it out and read it again. Then I called my therapist and we spent a whole session on it. What I eventually decided, with her help, was that I didn't need to respond, and I didn't need to forgive, and I didn't need to begin anything at all. The letter could just sit in the drawer. It could sit there for a year, for 10 years, for the rest of my life. Whether I ever opened that door again was nobody's business but mine. About a year after the videos, I quit the dental office. Not because of anything bad. Just because I'd been offered a part-time position at a small clinic that worked with kids in foster care and group homes, doing free cleanings and basic dental work for kids who hadn't seen a hygienist in years, sometimes ever. The pay was worse. The work was better. I started spending my weekends volunteering with the Twin Cities organization that helped young people leaving abusive home situations find safe housing. Sometimes I'd sit on a couch in someone's transitional apartment and just listen to a 15-year-old tell me what their stepfather, or their mother, or their grandmother had done to them, and I would think about Walt in his aluminum boat. About how he hadn't asked me to be brave. He had just wrapped me in a blanket and sat with me on the ride back to shore. That's all most of us actually need. Someone to come close enough to see us, and then sit with us while we figure out how to keep going. Glenn moved out of state eventually. I heard from a cousin that he ended up in Arizona working for someone else's contracting company, living alone. The restraining order is still in place. He has not contacted me in over 2 years. My mother and I exchange occasional letters now, slow and careful, like two people learning a language. Neither of us speaks well. I have not invited her to come stay with me. She has not asked. We are both, I think, surprised that we are managing even this much. I am not going to tell you that I am healed, because I don't really believe in being healed the way some people talk about it. What I am is rebuilt. I am a different person than the girl who climbed off that boat in wet jeans, and most days I am okay with who that person is. I have a cat who loves me. I have an aunt and uncle who showed up. I have a job that means something. I have a voice that, when I finally used it, turned out to be louder than the man who tried to make me invisible. If you are out there watching this and something in it sounds like your own life, I want you to know two things. The first is that what was done to you was real, and you are allowed to call it what it was, even if everyone around you is still calling it something softer. The second is that the people who hurt you spent a long time betting on your silence. They built whole lives on it. The day you stop being silent is the day their construction starts to crack, and that day belongs to you, on your timeline, in your voice, no matter how long it takes you to get there. I sat on that sandbar at 15 years old thinking nobody was coming. Somebody did come. And then later, when I needed to be the one who came for myself, I figured out how to do that too. So can you. Tell someone. Tell a therapist. Tell a friend. Tell a stranger on the internet. Tell yourself out loud in your own kitchen, with nobody else listening. Just start. The rest of the story is yours to write. When I look back at that 15-year-old girl shivering on a sandbar in Lake Superior, the thing that still surprises me is how clearly the whole pattern lays itself out once you have enough distance from it. Glenn didn't wake up one September morning and decide to do something monstrous out of nowhere. He had been practicing smaller versions of that cruelty for years, in the way he'd cut me off mid-sentence at dinner, in the way he'd forget to pick me up from school, in the way he made my mother choose his comfort over my safety, 100 small times before he finally asked her to do it the big way. And she said yes, the big way, because she had already said yes to all the small ones. Every cruelty in this story was built on the back of a smaller cruelty that nobody bothered to name out loud. That's what I want anyone watching this to take with them. The dangerous moment in a family isn't usually the one that ends up on the police report. It's the 100 quiet moments before it, when somebody could have spoken up and chose not to. I think about Walt a lot. He didn't do anything dramatic. He took the long way back to the marina because he felt like it. He looked twice when something seemed off. He wrapped me in the blanket he had, not the blanket he wished he had. I've come to believe that's most of what being a decent person actually looks like, day to day. You pay attention. You go slightly out of your way. You trust your eyes when something doesn't sit right. The world has plenty of Glens in it. What it doesn't have enough of is Walt's. And the difference between them isn't talent or courage or even kindness, exactly. It's a kind of quiet attention to other people, a refusal to look away from the thing you're seeing just because it would be more convenient. The other thing I learned, the hard way, is that strength is not the same as silence. For 9 years, I thought I was being strong by not talking about what Glenn did to me. I was just being quiet, which is a very different thing, and it was costing me more than I understood. The day I finally hit record and told the truth was the day I stopped letting him be the loudest voice in my own life. That's the kind of strength I want for anyone watching this. Not the strength to endure forever, but the strength to set the thing down when you're ready, and to name it out loud. Even if your hands are shaking the whole time. The people who hurt you are counting on your silence. That is the one consistent thing about them. Take it back when you're ready. Not for revenge, not even really for justice, but because your voice belongs to you, and it always did, and no Sandbar and no stepfather and no mother who looked the other way ever had the right to take it from you in the first place.